It's been described as one of the most volatile moments in Indonesia in more than 20 years. Protests, furious clashes, alleged police brutality, riots, firebombing and looting.
Indonesia is burning. Parliament buildings have been set on fire. The streets roar with voices of defiance. Water cannons clash with fire. Stones rain down on riot shields. Jakarta trembles. Lives have been lost, homes destroyed, and politicians' mansions ransacked. At first, everything seemed to happen too quickly. But beneath the surface, anger had been piling up until it finally erupted like lava. And guess what? An anime cartoon skull became the symbol of defiance in Indonesia. The flag waves on every corner, no longer just a symbol of anime fantasy, but a pirate cry for freedom. Freedom from the worst that was packaged as the best. But why did Indonesians suddenly erupt like wildfire? And what are they demanding? Now, topics like protests and violence often get suppressed by the YouTube algorithm. But you can help us fight that by simply hitting the like button. Thank you. In 1976, a 26-year-old lieutenant was sent to Timor to track down the leader of Timor's independence movement, Lobato. 2 years later, the lieutenant's unit found and killed Lobato, and his severed head was mailed to the then Indonesian president as proof of death. The lieutenant's name was Prabowo Subianto, and he is the current president of Indonesia. Years later, in 1998, during mass student-led protests against the repressive regime in Indonesia, Prabowo led operations to kidnap, arrest, and torture activists, 22 of whom were disappeared by state authorities. But this did not stop him from becoming the president of Indonesia. In 2024, Prabowo Subianto rose to power as the 8th president of Indonesia. Before Prabowo came to power, his party made 5 powerful promises that won the hearts of millions of Indonesians. For some, he was a strong man, promising stability. For others, a controversial figure with a shadowed past. Yet, it wasn't the man alone. It was the spark that ignited the fire. He first vowed to supercharge economic growth, pushing it from 5% to 8% by harnessing Indonesia's vast natural resources and driving new industries. Second, he pledged to make Indonesia self-sufficient in food, ending dependency on costly imports. As defense minister, Prabowo had already launched the controversial food estate project, clearing swamps for cassava plantations. Now, he promised to expand 3 million hectares dedicated to rice, corn, and soybeans. To put that into perspective, that's the size of Belgium. Third, he promised to reduce Indonesia's dependence on imported fuel by blending more palm oil into biodiesel. Indonesia, after all, is the world's largest palm oil producer. Its target? A 50% blend by the end of 2025, from 35%. Fourth, he pledged to nearly double government revenue as a share of GDP, from 12% to 23%, using new technologies but without raising taxes. And finally, the biggest and most emotional promise, the $28 billion free nutritious meals program, meant to provide food to 83 million children and pregnant women, a bold plan to fight one of Indonesia's most painful struggles, malnutrition. It's hard to believe that a plan that sounded so noble ended up sparking anger among millions of Indonesians, and for the right reason. You see, initially the free meals program sounded very powerful, because the reality on the ground is heartbreaking. Until March of 2025, 23.8 million Indonesians were officially living in poverty. But if you measure poverty by World Bank standards, those living on less than $6.85 a day, then the true number is staggering. 171.9 million people, or more than 60% of the population. This poverty fuels a silent epidemic. Nearly 1/3 of Indonesian children under 5 are stunted due to malnutrition. 1 in 4 people are anemic, and children and maternal malnutrition account for almost half of all child deaths in the country. To put it simply, malnutrition is killing children at a scale Indonesia can no longer ignore. So when Prabowo promised free nutritious meals, it wasn't just a campaign slogan, it was a lifeline. Parents, teachers, farmers, and the whole nation believed in this powerful plan. But then came the harsh reality of governance. Because everything needed money. To fund the flagship free nutritious meals program, the government announced massive spending cuts across vital sectors. Instead of prosperity, these cuts deepened an already growing cost of living crisis. And with youth unemployment climbing to 16%, the highest in 3 years, the anger of the young boiled over. The numbers were shocking. The Ministry of Public Works was forced to slash its budget by 80%, crippling basic infrastructure maintenance. The Health Ministry lost nearly 20 trillion rupiah, one of the biggest absolute cuts in Indonesia's history. To make matters worse, around 400 Indonesian schoolchildren fell ill after eating free school meals. This angered the citizens even more. The ripple effects spread everywhere. At the Ministry of Economic Affairs, lights were literally shut off during office hours to save electricity. The National Library cut its opening hours. The Finance Ministry canceled the prestigious 2025 ministerial scholarship. Even the Ministry of Higher Education redirected research funds away from innovation toward only one goal: propping up the school meals program. These cuts caused massive outrage among college students, who argued that the reductions would make education more expensive while gutting scholarships. On February 17th, thousands of students poured into the streets to protest against these budget cuts. The movement was dubbed Dark Indonesia, a clear rejection of the president's promise of a so-called Golden Indonesia. By February 20th, it had reached its peak. Hundreds of thousands of students marching in Jakarta and in other cities. This was the first wave of protests in Indonesia. But President Prabowo dismissed their anger, declaring that the cuts were necessary to fuel the country's economic future. As if one blunder wasn't enough, they did another one. In March of 2025, Indonesia's parliament passed a law that sent shockwaves through the nation. It gave the military a larger role in government, undoing decades of reforms meant to keep soldiers out of politics. Active duty officers could now serve in 14 civilian institutions instead of 10. Retirement ages were raised, allowing generals to cling to power even longer. And for many Indonesians, this was déjà vu. The military's dual function, controlling both security and civilian life, had been the backbone of former President Suharto's authoritarian rule, and often called a repressive regime. And here's the twist. Suharto's former son-in-law, Prabowo, once accused of abducting activists in the regime's final days, is today Indonesia's president. During his early military service, Prabowo's unit arrested and killed Nikolai Loboto, the leader of East Timor's independence movement. His severed head was delivered to then-President Suharto. With that mission, Prabowo began his long career, one marked by power, ambition, and allegations of brutality. As a general during Indonesia's occupation of East Timor in the 1980s and the 1990s, he organized gangs of hooded killers to terrorize civilians tied to the independence struggle. He was also allegedly involved in one of the bloodiest events of that war, the Caracas Massacre, in which 300 Timorese, mostly civilians, were hunted down and killed by Kopassus Special Forces. In 1996, he was dispatched to West Papua, where the Free Papua movement clashed with the Indonesian army. Prabowo's units carried out reprisal attacks, burning villages accused of aiding separatists. 2 years later, during the Asian financial crisis, student-led protests against Suharto shook Jakarta. Prabowo carried out a campaign to kidnap, arrest, and torture activists. 22 disappeared. 13 still remain missing to this day. After Suharto fell from power, Prabowo was kicked out of the military because of his involvement in these abductions. For years, even the United States, which had previously trained him, wouldn't allow him to enter the country. And yet, decades later, he now rules from the same presidential palace where, every Thursday, families still gather for a candlelight vigil. They wait for justice. They wait for the return of the disappeared. And because of Prabowo's own dark and controversial history, so deeply tied to Indonesia's authoritarian past, many saw his rise not as reform, but as regression. For the veterans of Suharto-era democracy movements, this was not a new beginning, but the return of old ghosts. Hundreds of activists camped outside of parliament in defiance. For the president, withdraw the military from civilian life, end the criminalization of demonstrators, launch an independent investigation into the deaths of Afan Kini I, Umar Amaruddin, and others killed during the crackdown. For the DPR, the House of Representatives, freeze their own salary and allowance increases, cancel new perks and pensions, open their budgets to the public, and let the Anti-Corruption Commission dig into lawmakers who had abused their office. For the political parties, discipline arrogant cadres, show real commitment to the people, open dialogue with students in civil society. For the police, release all detained protesters, stop the violence, prosecute the commanders who ordered it. For the military, return to the barracks, stop acting as police. Commit to staying out of civilian lives. For the economic ministries, guarantee decent wages for teachers, health workers, drivers, and ordinary laborers. Prevent mass layoffs. Sit down with unions to fix outsourcing and wage systems. These were not whispers. These were the shouted demands from the streets of Jakarta, Surabaya, Makassar, Medan. The people want immediate action. But the 17+8 movement didn't stop there. Beyond the urgent demands, they issued 8 deeper reforms to be completed within a year. 1. Clean up Parliament. 2. Reform political parties. 3. Draft a fairer tax system. 4. Pass a real anti-corruption law with asset seizures. 5. Transform the police into a humane, professional force. 6. Send the military back to the barracks, once and for all. 7. Strengthen independent watchdogs and human rights bodies. And 8. Fix economic and labor policies for good. By early September, the movement was no longer just about Afan, or even just about parliamentary greed. The streets of Jakarta now echoed with chants from students, activists, and the country's most powerful labor unions. Led by the coalition of labor unions and the Labour Party, protesters gathered in the capital with a simple but explosive list of demands. And at the very top, an end to outsourcing. For years, millions of Indonesians have been trapped in a system where companies hired them through third-party agencies on short-term contracts, robbing them of basic protections, stability, and dignity. They demanded to stop this. They also called for a higher minimum wage, a freeze on mass layoffs, and reforms to labor taxes that weighed unfairly on workers already struggling to survive. And Jakarta was not alone. Similar protests erupted in other cities across the country, a wave that made it clear this wasn't just a capital city movement. President Prabowo went on air with a carefully balanced message. On one hand, he announced that Parliament had agreed to reduce housing allowances and scale back costly foreign trips. But he was quiet about an Indonesian National Armed Forces law rectification. He even promised an investigation into the killing of Afan, vowing that those responsible would be brought to justice. But his warning was just as clear. While his government would respect peaceful assembly, he declared that looting and rioting were nothing less than terrorism and treason. His order to police and the military was uncompromising. Take the strongest possible action against the destruction of public facilities and the looting of homes and economic centers. And so they did. Across the country, more than 3,000 people have been arrested or detained, hundreds injured, at least 20 missing. Tear gas and rubber bullets have become the soundtrack of cities like Bandung, where protests near two universities descended into chaos. International alarm is growing. The United Nations called for an independent investigation into the alleged use of disproportionate force. Human Rights Watch accused Indonesian authorities of acting irresponsibly by branding protests as treason, reminding the world of Indonesia's long, bloodied history of excessive force against its own people. Foreign embassies from the US to Australia, from France to Canada, have issued travel warnings. Citizens have been told, stay away from the streets, stay away from the crowds. But Indonesian diasporas living in Australia, Japan, Germany, and other countries are openly protesting in these nations with 17+8 placards, supporting their own people. Indonesia's president has replaced 5 ministers in a lightning cabinet reshuffle after deadly protests. 5 ministers lost their jobs, including the finance minister, who previously served as the executive director of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and managing director of the World Bank, and Budi Gunawan, the coordinating minister for politics and security. Prabowo chose the chairman of the Deposit Insurance Corporation to replace one of Indonesia's longest-serving finance ministers. Prabowo also removed ministers of cooperatives, youth and sport, and the minister for migrant workers' protection. However, the faith of the country is uncertain, because people are not ready to believe in the government or its promises about the future. The protests that once seemed crazy finally started cooling down. I said crazy because even foreign embassies, including the US, have issued warnings. TikTok, with its 100 million Indonesian users, suspended live streaming to keep the platform from becoming a spark in this digital wildfire. And this was the anger of a nation of 280 million people across 17,000 islands. In fact, not even Bali was spared. The island of tourists and temples became a battleground, where students and online motorcycle drivers stormed the police headquarters. Many now question whether outside forces fueled the protests, channeling public anger against the government. For the last few years, Indonesia has tried to hold both hands, the US and China. However, it's true that Indonesia's tilt towards Chinese investment and state visits shows that the current government is more pro-China, which is seen as a strategic drawback for America and other countries. President Prabowo made China his first overseas bilateral visit. It resulted in agreements between China and Indonesia worth up to $10 billion, primarily focused on green energy and technology. Until 2022, President Prabowo was banned from entering the US on account of allegations of human rights abuses, related to his time in Indonesia's Special Forces Unit, Kopassus, which led to him being forcibly discharged from the military in 1998. Yet the ban was removed after then-President Joko Widodo appointed Subianto as Indonesia's defense minister, and he was subsequently invited to Washington in 2020 during the first Trump administration. After China, Washington was Subianto's second official presidential visit destination in November of 2024, which shows, not only for Indonesia but for China and the US, Indonesia is a crucial player in this region. Indonesia lies between the Indo-Pacific Oceans, controlling the lifelines of global trade. the Strait of Malacca, the Sunda Strait, where most of East Asia's transport passes. To control the South China Sea, these passages are very important. Indonesia has good relations with almost every major power, so there are less chances of outside interference. And whatever is happening in Indonesia, it is somehow all the fault and failure of government policies. And as we saw, numbers clearly prove that. And what happens next? Will the president succeed in saving his regime, or will we see another coup like in Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh? Only time will tell.